I think we are good to go. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar. This is the second webinar in our Society for Conservation Biology Marine Section webinar series. Today's topic today is locally led ocean governance, interfaces of sustainable fisheries, high seas governance, and overcoming parachute science. I'm Laura Nieminen. I'm the student officer of the SCB Marine section, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. First, we have some housekeeping. All right, we have some housekeeping. If we could kindly ask everybody to type their questions in the Q&A box below. We will keep an eye on the chat box if everybody or if someone accidentally types theirs in there. Right. And also, in addition to today's webinar program, we'll share a link for our speaker and panelist bios for you guys to browse. And lastly, I'd like to just remind everyone that the webinar is recorded and we will make it publicly available on our YouTube channel. Great. Right, now we have our first presentation by Sheena Talma. Talma is the Science and Knowledge Exchange Program Manager at the Necton Mission. The topic of the presentation is Turning the Tide on Parachute Science for Effective Global Ocean Governance. Sheena Talma is a marine biologist from Seychelles. She specializes in fisheries and ichthyology. Sheena has a passion for generating science within Seychelles and the Indian Ocean, and she is especially interested in education and awareness raising programs that will help a new generation of marine scientists and enthusiasts. Sheena, would you like to reveal yourself? Great, just over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the lovely introduction. So I'm just going to share my screen, if you can give me 2 seconds. There's a little bit of a delay, but we are getting there. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to be part of this amazing lineup of speakers. That is just, there we go. Yeah, so it's a real pleasure to be here and really privileged to be part of this amazing lineup of speakers that are talking about ocean governance. Like Laura has said, my name is Sheena Talma. I am from the Seychelles, which for those of you who don't know where that is, it's in the Indian Ocean. It's just off the east coast of Africa, and it's made up of 115 islands that spread out more than 1.4 million square kilometers throughout that ocean space. So traditionally we call it, small island states, but I'm actually, I think, from a large ocean state, just given the amount of water that surrounds these tiny specks of land. So like many coastal countries or large ocean states, the Seychelles depends on the bounties of that comes from the ocean, whether that's fisheries and whether that's because it attracts a whole bunch of tourists, which helps with our economy. And because we're in this amazing place in the ocean, it means that we rely on the ocean for our primary source of protein, but it also means that it's a really great hub for science. And what we've seen throughout the decades is that the science produced, focused on marine science, has increased from the 1960s all the way up now to the 2010s. However, when we look at who's leading that science, we do notice that a lot of that research is coming from overseas territories such as the US or the UK. And that a lot of this research isn't being led by Seychelles natives. Now, this isn't new to science, and it's definitely not new to an environment like the Seychelles, right? A lot of other countries see similar trends, and we refer to this trend as parachute science. Now, when I say parachute science, I'm not talking about how parachutes work. Basically, it's the practice whereby international scientists, typically from higher income countries, conduct field studies in another country, typically of lower income, and then complete the research in their home country without any further effective communication or engagement from the people from the nation where they conducted their studies. Simply put, this is when a scientist from somewhere, perhaps like the UK or the US, have a great idea and want to do research on an environment like coral reefs that perhaps isn't as common in their area of the world, and travel all the way to somewhere like the Philippines or Seychelles to study this area without actually getting the people on the ground involved. Now, like I said, it's not new to science. We all know about this. We all know it happens, and we refer to it under a couple of different terms, including colonial science. And if you haven't read this paper by Dr. Asha de Vos, I would really advise you to read it. It gives her personal perspectives on how colonial science is really detrimental. We also refer to it as parasitic science or helicopter science. But it all pretty much means the same thing. It means that we aren't working together in a collaborative way. And generally that research is driven from one group of people that are generally from higher income countries. Now, where does this happen? It happens in all parts of science. It happens in global health research, microbiology, genomics. I have a genetics background, and a lot of the papers that are produced, even from the Indian Ocean, actually doesn't have a lot of people on those papers that are from that region. But it also happens in geosciences, in ecology, in conservation, in marine advocacy, and in marine research. Again, there's some really great papers here, and I would advise everyone to have a look at them. I really enjoyed the new paper by Dr. Belhabib, who's also giving a talk tomorrow, and that's the one on ocean science and advocacy work and how it's really important to get all the voices around the table. Now, we wrote a paper about parachute science within coral reef systems, and the group of scientists are from across the world. Again, because having different perspectives brings a lot to the table. Now, why did we choose coral reef systems? Well, as everyone knows, coral reefs are extremely engaging. They're a great way to get out if you live close to a coast. I love to go to the beach and just swim on top of coral reefs so that you can see the biodiversity that lives there. So they're important for a personal perspective, for mental health. They're important because they're a hub of biodiversity. They provide a primary source of protein for a lot of coastal countries, especially countries like Seychelles, Philippines, and coastal countries around the coast of Africa. But they've also been a focus of study for a long time, whether that's in global climate change, genetics. So there's a lot of attention and research that has gone into the system. And furthermore, they're generally found in tropical and subtropical areas. So a lot of the northern countries, for example, Denmark, won't have these tropical coral reef systems. So often you'll have to move away from your host country into someone else's space to kind of study coral reefs. So we focused on looking at who was dominating these publications. So the first thing we did was we went through the literature to find out where the highest number of publications were coming from. And what we saw is that out of the top 10 countries producing research on coral reefs, the majority of that was coming from higher income countries. Places like Germany and even the Netherlands, who don't even have a tropical coral reef system. And when you look at what percentage, for example, which parts of the world have the highest number of coral reefs, and that there's a huge mismatch between the people producing it and where those environments are found. For example, on the right-hand side, Indonesia, Australia, and Philippines have the highest percentage of global reef habitats. So then we delved further into this and looked at specifically Indonesia, Australia, and Philippines to find out who was leading the research going on in coral reef systems. And what we saw is that, for example, in Indonesia and Philippines, 40% of the publications had no host nation scientists included. That meant that no one from the Philippines or Indonesia were part of the publications that were produced from the research conducted. And in addition, only 30 to 40% was led by people from Indonesia or the Philippines. Whereas if we looked at Australia, a bit of a higher income country that also has a lot of coral reef cover, 20% of the publications had no host nation scientists. So only 20% of publications coming out of Australia didn't have Australians on there. And on the other hand, the leadership, so who is leading that research, was highly dominated by people from that host country, so from Australia. So what does this mean? It means that parachute science is more prevalent in lower middle income nations and less so in higher income nations. And this is due to many factors, including access to resources. So why is this an issue, right? For example, some of the issues that parachute science has is that it creates a dependency on external expertise. For example, within the Seychelles, it's where we don't generate a lot of information about our own environments, and we have a dependency on researchers from outside to do that research for us. It doesn't address local research needs. If you aren't collaborating from the onset, what often happens is that important questions for people living on the ground aren't answered because they're never included in the process of creating the research questions that need to be answered. It hinders local research efforts because the researchers that are working in the same environments or fields perhaps don't publish as much because they don't have the access to resources. It creates a lack of trust between researchers in the host country and researchers from abroad. And this is something that I've seen in my personal work, working with governments. As soon as you mention something like DNA or genetics, often the response is, are they going to take those resources away and create big pharmaceuticals? So it shows a lack of trust and a lack of understanding of some of those aspects of science. And something that we don't think about a lot is that, excluding one group of people from the table means that you're excluding a wealth of knowledge and practical skills that are found on the ground. Again, an example from my local experience is that although we won't publish a lot, sometimes you have lots of reports, and those reports aren't online, so you'll need to be able to communicate with other scientists locally to find that information. How can we stop parachute science? So there's a whole range of different ways we can do that. We have to recognize that it's a systemic problem, so it needs to happen on different levels of the academic chain. But we can start as individuals and as research groups by finding collaborators on the ground and ensuring that they are part of the process when designing the research that we want to do. Liaise with government and funding bodies from the host nation where we're working, because they might have funding pots that could be put together with your research and create a much better research agenda. Ensure that you're agenda is developed together in a collaborative process. Engage with the next generation of scientists, because they're the ones that are up and coming and will be able to lead the research into the next steps. Share academic literature. This is something that a lot of especially low and middle income countries face, is the fact that getting hold of academic literature is expensive and difficult to find. Know your regulatory landscape and ensure that you're transparent in your publishing. So, you know, when you're publishing with local scientists, ensure that they're part of that system as opposed to just putting someone on there as a token. Now, all these are really important, especially when thinking about ocean governance and sustainable fisheries, because it's the people on the ground that need the information the most to use it in policy and management. So what does good practices look like? And there are quite a few examples that exist out there, which is encouraging. Whether that's Seamester in South Africa, which aims to build early career scientists by including them in research from designing to delivering, or whether that's projects like My Deep Sea, My Backyard, which aims to ensure that scientists on the ground have access to equipment that will allow them to research the deeper parts of their ocean. As we all know, the deep sea side of science is really difficult to get into as an under-resourced country because it needs specialized equipment. Or whether that looks like the Seychelles Marine Spatial Plan, which essentially got more than 200 stakeholders around the table for a long period of time to be able to come up with the right strategies to protect 30% of the Seychelles EEZ. Or whether it looks a bit like the project that I was involved with, where we co-developed, co-produced, and co-disseminated a deep sea mission within the Seychelles waters to investigate what our ocean looked like below 30 meters, where generally we have most access to. So why put in all this effort, right? It's a lot easier to just do the research and publish the paper. But if we want long-term change, especially within spaces of fisheries and general global ocean governance, we need to do it together. And I'll end with a blurb from Dr. Belaviv's new paper, where she says that in fisheries science, any conservation or management solution has to emanate from a reality where eating fish is not only a privilege for some, but a necessity for many. Fish and fishing are also a culture and an identity. Our ancestors also fished for food and for ceremonial purposes. And what she was speaking about here is in rebuttal to the Seaspiracy documentary that was released recently. And I think the emphasis here is ensuring that when we are advocating, when we are creating new policies, that is all hinders on science, but it needs to start with collaborative and inclusive forms of science. Because without having that co-development stage and co-producing our science, then everything else will be done from a one-sided or uninformed narrative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheena, for an amazing presentation. This topic is also close to my heart, so it was so lovely to see people talking about it. Great. You can still put your questions for Sheena through during Hugh's presentation. So please keep them coming and in the Q&A box. But yeah, like I said in the beginning, we'll keep an eye on the chat box as well. Next in line, we have our final presentation by Dr. Hugh Govan, and Dr. Govan is an expert on ocean policy and governance. The topic of Dr. Govan's presentation is Parties to Nauru Agreement, PNA, Model of Ocean Governance. He has lived and worked in Solomon Islands, Central and South America, throughout the Pacific, and has recently left Fiji after 18 years. He advises the locally managed marine area network in Asia and the Pacific, which has refined and extended community-driven approaches to resource management from the Pacific into a global phenomenon. Over to you, Hugh, now. Oh, do you want to unmute yourself?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, all good.
Yes, well, thank you for having me. Great presentation, Sheena, and I'll get stuck straight in with a presentation using some of the last decade's experiences in ocean governance from the Pacific. I think it complements some of the things that have been raised already. Of course, everybody knows how important the Pacific Ocean is to Pacific Island people, but I doubt anybody could express it better than Apeli Haofa, who says, "We are the sea, we are the ocean." It's intrinsic to the lives of all Pacific Islanders. Massive domain that covers a third of the planet. And more recently, since the law of the sea, of course, some boundaries have been drawn on it. These are the EEZs of the Pacific Island countries and territories. But Pacific Islanders have been using the Pacific for many, many generations, over something like 100 million square kilometers, voyaging, colonizing, traveling between countries back and forth. And this leads Apeli Haofa to say, perhaps no people on Earth are more suited to be guardians of the world's largest ocean than those for whom it has been home for generations. Amongst all the values that the Pacific Islands have for the Pacific people, the one that comes up the most and is central to the Pacific's blue economy are fish. Government are particularly interested in the offshore tuna fisheries because a large proportion of the value of that, of government revenue comes from offshore and tuna fisheries, whereas communities receive their food and daily sustenance from coastal fisheries largely. On the other hand, both coastal and offshore fisheries contribute almost equally to national gross domestic products in the region. The Pacific Islands face considerable challenges. I note that we've already introduced the idea of large ocean states, and this is used in the Pacific as well. Some of the challenges are just the huge size of the ocean. The ocean is massive compared to the amount of land that people are living on. And in fact, for most countries, the proportions are even more skewed, as Papua New Guinea has a large landmass and changes the proportion of land to ocean in this graph. Another notable fact is that the inshore fishing area, which is so vital to coastal, well, to island communities in general, is actually a very small fraction of the ocean domain. Another key feature I wanted to bring up is that there's a very low amount of resources available for managing this ocean, at least in independent countries, both in terms of staff and budgets. The allocations are well below the international sort of standards in terms of the value of the fish that are being managed, and let alone the size of the ocean that is being considered. And this is even worse in most cases for environment departments. On the other hand, there are some major opportunities which I think the Pacific has been able to leverage particularly well. On the one hand, we have the maritime boundaries. The Pacific Island, the recently independent Pacific Island nations were instrumental in the global negotiations for the law of the sea. And this has resulted in approximately 28 million square kilometers under the jurisdiction of the Pacific Island countries and also territories. This is an amazing asset, and these are rights and responsibilities that the Pacific Islands share. And inshore, traditionally and in customary practice and rights, the communities have had rights over their inshore areas and the resources in those areas. This has been detected for almost all the countries in the Pacific, and quite a few of them, the majority, still have some sort of community or customary rights enshrined in national legislation. Interestingly, some of the countries that lost these customary rights have had to reinvent them in order to be able to properly manage the coastal fisheries. So these are two very important opportunities that the Pacific Islanders are able to use going forward. Moving to offshore fisheries, very well known in the world, the tuna in our tins, the tuna in our sashimi, coming largely from the Pacific. A dock value, that is when it's landed at the docks side, it's worth $3 to $4 billion US, but the final value by the time it's getting to shops in Europe or wherever, nearer to 30 billion. And more than half of that is coming from the Pacific Islands fisheries. Sorry. The stocks are shared across 8 of 14 countries. And the major stocks we're talking about here are skipjack. As you can see, they're mainly over the Western and Central Pacific. And the 8 countries that have the fortune that these fish migrate through their waters are Palau, PNG, Solomon Islands, Nauru, Kiribati, Tuvalu, FSM, and the Marshall Islands. These countries are members of an arrangement called the Parties to the Nauru Agreement. And after decades of notably very low benefits coming from the Pacific's tuna, about 2010, the Parties to the Nauru Agreement started seriously implementing their arrangement in order to improve the benefits flowing from tuna and to achieve sustainability of the stocks. This progress was remarkable, particularly because other regional organizations hadn't seemed to be able to produce any progress, including the regional fisheries management organizations that are contemplated under UN arrangements. The Nauru Agreement is based strongly on the EEZs, or the national rights that are provided by the law of the sea, but took a very important step in only including in the discussions the 8 states which were major stockholders in that the tuna swim through their areas, and not allowing space for the distant water fishing nations to sabotage the discussions or influence the outcomes. And sadly also making sure that other Pacific Island states that did not have tuna stocks were not particularly strongly represented in terms of them not having a big stake. The way forward that was chosen to be highly practicable, and that is that despite perhaps best scientific approaches involving setting quota, as this is something that has historically and globally not been an easy thing to implement and has led to some of the tragic stock declines we've seen, the PNA members chose an effort-based approach, which is a vessel day scheme. In other words, an approach that only relies on counting whether fishing boats are inside your fishing area or not. So they sell access to the fishing area and they estimate the amount of fish those boats will be able to catch in the time they're in there. And they enforce this using available technology, which includes satellite transponders, satellite observations, and 100% observer coverage. That is somebody in each vessel checking that the rules are being followed. To date, the stocks are rated to be sustainable within fishing limits. There's no overfishing. This is the principal stock is skipjack, which is the blue dot. And this graph is being used by regional organizations to monitor and assess the state of the fisheries. And this means that the Pacific Ocean's major tuna stocks are by and large healthy compared to those of the other major oceans. As you can see, the green bar is basically the Western Central Pacific. The others are Indian Ocean, etc. The major result from all of this is that the control over most of the skipjack rich waters allows the countries to dictate terms in the shape and form of a cartel, essentially. And therefore, anybody wanting to fish in there has to bid for access days, vessel days. And this has led to about 5 times more revenue from access fees than was hitherto the practice, which is about $500 million a year, which in some countries is a major national revenue. As you saw, the stocks have been able to be kept sustainable based on limiting the number of vessel days that are sold every year. But of very big interest is the fact that conditions can be placed on these licenses, which may involve what can be done in terms of bycatch. It might be to do with waste or the use of fish aggregating devices. And very interestingly, also whether the fishing vessels can access other fishing grounds, including the high seas. The high seas pockets, for example, are outside of national jurisdiction. In fact, they're governed under totally different arrangements where the distant water fishing nations have actually more power over the management arrangements and have traditionally been able to undermine sustainable management of the fisheries. But as a condition of licenses, if you want access to the major fishing grounds in the PNA waters, then you are not allowed to fish in the high seas pockets. And this graph from the PNA shows, this map shows that the pockets, at least to the west, are not being particularly fished. These are boats that are obeying the conditions on their license. Important feature here is that the eastern high seas, which is the yellow high seas mark over to the right or to the east, are not included in the license conditions. And as you can see, some vessels are choosing to actually fish preferentially in the high seas rather than to negotiate access into the jurisdictions. This also has interesting implications in terms of the choice of management tools, because although the impressive work produced by the Global Fishing Watch organization and website shows the intensity of fishing, quite often this particular map is shown to strengthen or to support the use of high seas MPAs or large scale marine protected areas. In fact, it shows more starkly that the EEZs are what are defining where fishing vessels are located in terms of, as you can see, the boundaries are highlighted where fishing vessels are fishing along the edge of the EEZs to capture fish that are coming out of people's EEZs, but the EEZs have either allowed or not allowed industrial fishing. And then you can see very clearly a case of French Polynesia, or in contrast, maybe Kiribati, etc. The other case I wanted to highlight is coastal fisheries. So coastal fisheries, based on the value being something similar to that of offshore fisheries, to people at least. And after decades of top-down paper parks and conservation initiatives from outside failing or not producing the results that were desired, recognition has been achieved of more locally driven approaches. These are where local objectives of communities are set and lead to management arrangements implemented by the communities. Usually it's around food, livelihoods, local values in terms of biodiversity, and also culture and the strengthening of rights. This, of course, has made up for the lack of capacity that governments have in terms of implementing resource management inshore, and also provides a management system that can be used for other things such as biodiversity, where no management system exists till now. These produce things like management plans. Well, this is a management plan, a whole management plan for a village in Fiji, so they're relatively simple, but it can also lead to a recognition that traditional approaches are also accepted management. Here is an example of Fiji, which is the country with the best mapped customary fishing areas. And you can see that over a couple of decades, more than 70% of the fishing grounds have got some sort of management plan based on traditional objectives and planning approaches, locally managed marine areas. This led to stakeholders in civil society in Fiji long ago proposing that the objective for coastal fisheries should be 100% of communities being supported to produce locally managed marine areas or inshore fisheries management. So in summary, the Pacific's most promising approaches are essentially driven locally, not particularly successful if it's driven outside or by central planners, and do tend to balance ecological, economic, and social needs. Pacific's most promising approaches rely on stakeholders that work together as a community, people in villages, or indeed when people in nations work together. So you have the examples of LMAs or the parties to the Nauru Agreement. But disappointingly, the Pacific's approaches are not always fully recognized in the conservation industry or lobby, and they're neither particularly well recognized as fisheries strategies. They do not receive huge political, institutional, or resourcing support even in the islands, but also at the international level. And they're extremely vulnerable to shifts in any of these rights regimes upon which they're built. So the 30% designation, the 30% objective of the conservation lobby is not being particularly well studied in terms of what its impact will be on these systems or the rights involved. And the countries and these approaches are extremely vulnerable to bilateral or side negotiations, lobbying from the distant water fishing nations and the big environmental organizations. So we have been calling for a long time for those promoting the top-down target setting and global conservation objectives to work with the Pacific in genuine dialogue to find out how we can all achieve our joint aspirations for a sustainable ocean and save the planet, basically, but respecting the regional policies to which local people do have more access in terms of seeking integrated management approaches, 100% coverage and support for coastal fisheries management and protection, and incorporating livelihoods and other community and national aspirations in these approaches. We've called for the search for opportunities to see how the models that we're seeing are successful can be supported and built on to contribute livelihood impacts, but also to improve management of offshore fish stocks and species that are not even in our jurisdictions, which is extremely important because the migratory fish may well be caught outside by other fleets outside of national jurisdictions. And there isn't a lot of money, so it's very important not to push countries to invest in tools that may not serve their purposes when they're barely able to finance existing approaches. There are also other things, other priorities, including some protected areas that are already vital and we consider important to protect, say, spawning grounds or cultural sites, and processes such as environmental impact assessments and regulation of development that are vital to be, and higher priorities indeed, that need to be funded and are being left to the side in a kind of willy-nilly panacea approach to marine protected areas. So the final considerations, and this is where my thinking was overlapping a lot with the previous presentation, but in all of this, what's happening? Who stands to benefit if Pacific Islands tuna management backslides, goes back to the previous situation? Who benefits if coastal fisheries management does not meaningfully progress, if it doesn't get any better? What's happening in the current situation? Who does it benefit if it doesn't get better? And who is providing the advice or the capacity? Are local researchers equal partners in joint research projects and funding? Are they at the table when priorities are being decided? And what is the cost of losing Pacific leadership in managing their own resources in their own way? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugh. Again, wonderful presentation. I'm just personally so excited about today's topic. So I've been nodding, my neck is starting to hurt so much. Right, I hope you all have enjoyed the presentations as well. We are moving on now to the Q&A section of this webinar. And We are going to address all the questions that we get. You can still send questions in. So don't worry if you didn't get yours in during the presentations. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Mohammed Arju. Arju will moderate the panel discussion and the QA. Arju is a conservation practitioner and a communicator. He currently works with the ICCA consortium as a communications coordinator, and he's also a board member at the SCB Marine. Over to you, Arju.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. For the panel discussion, we still have, I think, 20 more minutes, so it should be good enough. And we have also with us Dr. Edward Hind Ojan. He's a marine social scientist and works with the UK government. And of course, we have our speakers. I think the first questions are for Sheena. Sheena, if you want to respond to the very first one, that did you have come across positive examples also, not just parachute science?
No, of course. And I think some of the examples given at the end were more of those positive examples, whereas, for example, within the creation of the Seychelles Marine Spatial Plan, as Dr. Hugh mentioned, it's really important to ensure that the people on the ground are the ones saying where those areas need to be protected. It took more than, I think, 5 or 6 years to be able to get to that conclusion. You know, it wasn't something that happened overnight. It started in 2012, and only last year in 2020 were those areas finally designated. So I think that's a clear example of getting people around the table for one big aim, right? And ensuring that everyone is equally happy or equally unhappy with the areas suggested for protection. And I think one thing that was really emphasized when doing the Seychelles Marine Spatial Plan was that it can change, right? So those areas, given 5 more years from now down the line, if these areas are not doing what we hope they're supposed to be doing, it needs to be looked at again. And I think the other examples given are also with regards to the project that we wrote a paper about, an additional paper about co-producing and co-disseminating information, and how it's really important to get in from the very onset. Once you have the idea of, hey, this would be really cool, why don't we try and get collaborators together and create the questions that need to be answered with the people that can use that information, right? So the next example, which is the paper we published, as well as the Seychelles Marine Spatial Plan, are 2 examples that work and that have had collaborative approaches. I'm sure Dr. Hugh has a lot of examples he could contribute as well.
Yeah, thank you, Sheena. And I think for the second one, I will prefer to take 2 questions together. And if Edward, if you want to chip in, Nadia asked something that if you think language also play a role when in practicing parachute science, that if the researchers are not very familiar with the culture and language of the local communities, how do you think does it affect research and conservation?
Hugely, and thanks, Mohammed, for that question as well. I think, especially within the Seychelles, a lot of people speak Creole, which is a sort of dialect of French. And if you don't understand the cultural aspects of any kind of science that you're trying to conduct, especially within the fisheries realm, what you're producing is science that will, you know, generate interest within your spheres, and it doesn't include the people on the ground. Again, we've spoken about this previously, but I think that's the whole point. If you have collaborators within the country where your research is taking place, those collaborators are the ones that can guide you towards the right people, towards the and ensure that there's that intermediary, right? Being able to translate and ensure that your message is getting across and their voices are heard in a language where they can participate. I think participation is really important. And if we are going to do work collaboratively, then it means that we need to do the collaboration part in a language that is most important to the people we're working with.
Yeah, thanks, Sheena. Ed, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you, Arju. I think Sheena said something really interesting in her talk as well. I don't want to speak from the perspective of, you know, someone from a large ocean state, or, you know, but I think what you mentioned, Sheena, is that this has to be tackled at multiple institutional levels. And so a lot of the barriers are not at the level necessarily of the individual. So we can make individual actions. I guess it's a bit like the arguments people have around climate change. But, you know, if your access to major funding to do research is only by applying for funding in English or maybe French or Spanish, then does the foreign international researcher, you know, are they just a bridge to that funding? And like, do we need to get around that being a situation? So how can we tackle, I guess, those barriers within funding? But I mean, it doesn't just apply to funding; it applies to all that kind of, you know, if the increase in capacity involves you having to speak English and that is not your first language, that is a problem. I mean, we see that all the time, even in Europe, where I'm based, and with big European Union projects. Like you often want somebody on your funding bed who is based in Ireland or the UK because English is their first language, and you know that helps when you're writing a funding bid. It just does. That's a barrier to be overcome. I don't think we have a plan to get past that at the moment either.
Sorry, Mohammed. And just to add on to that, I think you're so right. I think that's it, right? It's systemic. It's like so well embedded in our science that we can see it in a lot of different sections of science, right? And you're right. I don't think anyone has a solution for the big strategic side of things, but it needs to happen on different levels, not just on an individual level and as research groups, but there are things that we can do to ensure that we minimize our effects and parachute science, but it has to happen within institutions.
Thanks, Sheena. We still have enough time to answer a few more questions, so please keep the questions coming. To Hugh, we of course we discussed it even outside this webinar, and we wrote together a few popular articles recently. But again, for our audience today, as you have said, that these approaches of local communities and on regional level, governments or other regional bodies, when they come up with their priorities based on their local needs, it doesn't get like enough traction within the global conservation regime. And this is something we see again and again. But I think my question will be to you, how exactly do you think that these issues we need to discuss more on forums like this, not as just addressing this problem? We can't do that from like webinars or other conferences, but still we don't see these issues discussed a lot. Hugh?
Well, the dynamic is extremely complicated because isolated countries do not have the funds. They do not have access to the machinery of aid and academic expertise, and so there's a huge incentive to welcome. I mean, apart from the cultural features of welcoming outsiders anyway and being very polite to them, there's a huge incentive to basically go along with proposals from outside. So it's very hard to set rules or anything that might appear unwelcoming to proposals of collaboration and partnership. And I think we're seeing this leading to very perverse outcomes. I think we need to recognize this. I know that the researchers don't mean to be causing the harm that they're causing, but unfortunately maybe we need me, but somebody that's ruder that can point these things out at the outset and say, look, guys, sort this out. A point I would like to raise is the LMMA network back in 2000 recognized this, in fact recognized that it was going to be very hard to work in communities and also collaborate across multiple organizations and different cultures without some groundwork. And so I personally think one of the biggest achievements of the LMMA was drafting of a social contract which governs anybody that supposedly is part of LMMA work, and we keep that alive to this day. That one is something that I think you could take to a greater scale. For example, it talks about things, do not talk for communities when they could be empowered to talk for themselves. So if possible, we would love to see community members being able to represent themselves, including in this forum. On the other hand, it does set rules about respect for communities. It set rules or recommendations basically on how you might report on communities, whether you would use data that's privileged, etc. And it has worked pretty well. It certainly made sure that a lot of suspicions or unease were set aside at the outset and allowing a much more fruitful collaboration. I think there would be a lot to be gained from examining how it's working now. It's particularly complicated to implement, partly because it's voluntary. And so really, even where people have broken it, it's still, you've got to weigh up, is it worth shaming them in public, or even doing, taking further steps than that, or hoping that you can work the relationship through. But it's also particularly complicated specifically in the area that we're talking about, which is academic publications, because a thing that's particularly frustrating to me, coming from a bilingual background, I appreciate how much effort almost everybody that I work with every day is making to speak English, which is not actually appreciated. And in the Pacific, it's ridiculous that there is English-French bilingual translation in the regional organizations, and yet most people in the Pacific don't speak either as a mother tongue. So, so this is pretty outrageous. And the culture of science is totally different from the culture of Pacific Island science. So in a publication, you're expected to write very complicated English jargon, quite often where actually simpler words would be available, but nevertheless, that's Western science for you. And people are expected to respond in very short order to complicated scientific discussions, which sometimes are completely up the wrong path anyway, but it's very hard to detect that because you're being bogged down and talking about some specific aspect of statistics or whatever, when in fact, maybe the whole question was wrongly framed from the outset. In other words, it's very complicated for the participants, but also this is the thing that is of most interest to outside academics. And so you're seeing situations where you would either be excluded from a publication simply because you couldn't participate in it in any meaningful way, or you're going to be tagged on to the end and not have actually the full ownership that you should have if you're a co-author. So I think this is a really important topic, because I think in the end, it leads to some of the bigger picture issues that I've highlighted in my presentation. In other words, who is determining the Pacific Ocean policy? We're basically being offered, do you want MPAs or not? So we have to choose MPAs. We're not being asked, could you develop something better? And there isn't a forum for that discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, so we have a very interesting question from Luciana again, that what kind of roles you think the regional institutions should have? I remember that there were some recent discussion, particularly because of the ongoing technical meetings at Conventional Biological Diversity and the next Global Biodiversity Framework, should we go for prioritize some kind of course, those things are needed, like global framework and so on, or should we invest more or talk about more or give more importance on regional mechanism? I think Luciana's question is very related to that. So Hugh and Edward, if you want to jump in about this question. Hugh, do you want to go first, or Edward?
I mean, in my introduction, perhaps it wasn't clear, but I pretty much have refused to work permanently for any organization for my entire career. I work where required and where mutually satisfactory. And this is because I think institutions automatically have a tendency to grow outside of what they're meant to be doing. And this is the case in almost all of the places I've been. And so in the Pacific, regional institutions produce some of the most excellent scientific research, say on tuna in the world. It's extremely important for any management decisions. the same time, these institutions are lobbying and struggling for funding at the expense sometimes of their other regional institutions, and certainly perhaps at smaller scale and local initiatives. And this is a trap you fall into. The other point with the regional institutions is that they may not necessarily be able to represent indigenous or local interests simply because they respond only to the national governments. They may consult or involve local people, but they absolutely are kept in line by the national governments. And in this sense, regionalism is as a two-edged sword. On the one hand, the Pacific, for example, has been able to make lots of progress internationally on topics such as climate change or nuclear testing in the Pacific. And these are, amplifying these voices is very welcome. On the other hand, when it comes to anything that impacts the national interest directly, usually regionalism isn't able to make any progress. In other words, regional agreements are not necessarily implemented where a national or a bilateral arrangement between a national country and, say, a distant water fishing nation come into play. And so I think the most important thing for a constructive way forward is to recognize the limits of regionalism, use it for its strengths, but not pretend that these defects don't exist.
I'll be really quick just to add to that, because I think it's good to hear from Sheena on a kind of more Indian Ocean experience. But just having worked in the Caribbean before, I thought what was very useful for me there in terms of regional organizations was listening to the work, obviously, and the movements coming from within the Caribbean itself. So with the Caribbean Large Marine Ecosystem Initiative, and if you're not that familiar with that kind of movement, probably worth checking out the scholarship of Lucia Fanning and colleagues, which is really good on that. But I mean, it aligns to like the Sustainable Development Agenda for 2030. I know Hugh's not a fan of targets and stuff, but perhaps one which is focused around regional self-sufficiency is a good one. I mean, there is this movement within the Caribbean to move towards being recognizing, as people, the speakers have said, that there's, some of these countries don't always have all the capacity they need to do all of the science all the time, but looking towards regional self-sufficiency where you rely less and less on outside foreign scientists. I think listening to those calls is really important. And I guess for people like myself, a recovering parachute researcher, I mean, we have to ask ourselves questions of like, is this about moving towards regional self-sufficiency, which I think partially it is, or is this about weaning ourselves off chance to do nice overseas work? And if that's the case, that needs to stop now. That is something which can be done in the short term, but we also need to listen to calls for regional self-sufficiency and support those where possible, but obviously not leading them.
Thank you. So before we go, how regionalism is working in the EU?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
As someone who's British, that's a tricky question to answer right now.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously within the EU, within the EU anyway, obviously that there are international policies. So I guess there was that international policy framework that helps. But again, I mean, regionalism, I don't know if there's that same kind of movement. I'd have to check.
Okay, thank you. We are almost out of time, but I can see that we have more questions to answer. So I will just request our speakers and panelists, if you want to chip in for very briefly to answer any of those questions. Also, Laura, I know you work with, your research interest is about high seas fisheries and so on. So do you want to add something very briefly?
Mainly when in Hugh's presentation, you had the very grave diagram of how big the ocean actually is compared to the land area. And then the inshore fisheries are producing the majority of the global catch. In fact, like the high seas catch is only 5 to 10% of the global catch. So it's merely replenishing whatever inshore fisheries are getting taken out of. So that's why also, because the inshore fisheries are the major source for fish protein in many communities, I think that's also another massive reason why including local communities and working with them and asking them what works and how should we do this and how have you done this, and really collaborating with local communities is really a key to keeping up the catches in inshore fisheries and ensuring that everybody gets their food.
Thanks, Laura. This is a very important question from Rachel Whitehurst-son, that the things you're saying that it's not okay with aquatic conservation, and you have certain recommendation that you want conservation need to be done that way. But to do that, to address the challenge of limited community inclusion, what systemic level needs to be targeted to make these changes? If you want to chip in very briefly.
Well, systemically, we can work on including more community voices, but unfortunately, that is kind of the basic input. The thing that is needed is a more Pacific Island think tank. The idea of a movement of Pacific Islanders that have worked up through the ranks to become policymakers, Pacific Island specialists in the Pacific. I and other outside, I've been there a long time, but even so, other outsiders are the policy drafters. In the end, policies are so tragically similar to policies from anywhere else in the world. And so the long-term solution is to try to find a space to empower local researchers to begin to be this movement of people that are thinking about the Pacific and welcoming inputs from outside, but not allowing themselves to be driven by other worldviews that have been particularly tragically useless in their own world. So it'd be really good to see how we can develop this space. But unfortunately, things are, it's very hard to see how that's going to happen, because universities and so on depend so much on outside collaborations.
Thanks, Hugh, and thank you for joining us today. We have another webinar before the International Day for Biological Diversity. Tomorrow, I think the link for the registration for this webinar is shared in the chat box by Laura. So please, if you are interested, probably I will see some of you tomorrow also. Thank you for joining us today. And with that, goodbye.